Hey, everybody. Thank you for tuning into Exploring Reality. Today, I have my friend Erik Manning on and Dr. Lydia McGrew to talk about her new upcoming book, Testimonies to the Truth. What's going on, Erik?
Hey, thanks for having me on, Than. Very excited to talk to Lydia about her new book.
Yeah. So, Dr. Lydia McGrew, I'm really excited to have you on. Why don't you just introduce yourself shortly for the audience, for anybody that doesn't know who you are?
My name is Lydia McGrew. I have my doctorate in English from Vanderbilt University in 1995. And since then, I have been publishing a lot professionally in philosophy, specializing in theory of knowledge and formal epistemology, probability theory, that kind of thing. Beginning in 2016 to 2017, I began to do more work in New Testament studies while also keeping up publishing in probability theory during that time, also. And so I've published 4 books now in New Testament. The fourth one has just come out. It's called Testimonies to the Truth: Why You Can Trust the Gospels. And what I'm trying to do is bring together the knowledge that I've gained in New Testament studies with my knowledge of probability and epistemology to try to, as I put it, make common sense rigorous.
Awesome. Erik, everybody knows who you are for the most part. And for just on the off chance nobody knows who you are here, why
Do
don't you
they?
just introduce yourself, plug your stuff?
Yeah, sure. No, I run the YouTube channel Testify. You could just the handle is at Testify Apologetics. We've been doing that for a couple years, mostly focusing on New Testament argument from miracles, gospel reliability, deity of Christ, a little bit here and there, and so yeah, and just answering skepticism. And I'm excited again to talk to Lydia because a lot of the I use her as a resource a lot, her
Mhm.
books, and so and I'm really this book, having read it, it's fantastic, and so I think your listeners, Stan, are really going to enjoy the book and definitely ought to
Yeah.
go out and get it.
I'm really excited about this too because you and I both got the chance to read this beforehand. And I don't know if this ever happens to you, but sometimes when I'm reading a book and I just really love it, I'll actually get an adrenaline rush while I'm reading it. It's just another resource out there that I'm just so excited about. And this is one of those books that did that for me. So I'm just very thankful for that. Um,
That's cool. That's cool.
so let's talk about this. Erik, do you want to ask your first question or?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, Lydia, what inspired you to write the book? Just maybe this is like several questions in one, but what inspired you to write the book? What are your hopes for it? And you, like you've mentioned, you've already written 3 other books on like gospel studies and different things like that. How is this one different?
So I had written Hidden in Plain View, which is somewhat geared to a lay audience on the argument from undesigned coincidences, which we'll be discussing later. Then both The Mirror or the Mask and The Eye of the Beholder, they're big books, they're thicker. And they're the books where I really kind of dig into the scholarship a little bit more, take cognizance of that. And I believe that a layman can read them and profit from them for sure. But they're a little daunting to look at first because they're thick. So I learned so much while writing those 3 books, and I thought, and so much more while writing T-Mom, as I call it, and The Eye of the Beholder, that I thought, man, I want to get this stuff out to a lay audience where if they looked at those books, they might say, I can't get through that. That just looks too daunting. So I wanted to put it out in a more lay friendly form. Um, and so that's kind of what inspired me to say, okay, now I'm going to take it. I'm going to write this a shorter volume, a volume more pitched to the level that Hidden in Plain View was pitched to the level of, but on this broader range of arguments. Now, what's different and new in this book from other books is, for one thing, that it has a lot of suggested questions and answers. I didn't do that in any of my other books. It also, I think, has more external confirmations than I did in any of the other books.
Hmm.
It has also some specific arguments that weren't found, like specific examples of types of arguments that weren't found in the other books. So, it's just got bits in it that weren't represented anywhere else, but it's also got a sort of a unity to it. It's being intended specifically for study, even for group studies, Bible studies, adult Sunday school, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's completely new.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely would recommend people get it for like small groups. The questions and discussion questions I thought were like really helpful. I was kind of quizzing myself, making sure that I got it. If I overlooked something, I'm like, well, I better go back and look what I missed there. But I thought that was really helpful, and it's definitely more like a positive case kind of a book that I think that pretty much everybody can understand and teach to their congregation or small group, or heck, I even think like youth group, college age definitely could benefit from going through it for sure. And so that's one of the things that I definitely really appreciated about it, is it was just like super digestible for everybody, because the gospels we know are just constantly under attack. Every time it's Christmas time or Easter, you can't even really turn on the TV or put on YouTube or something without seeing somebody trying to introduce some kind of skepticism. And so I think this is a great way to inoculate people against a lot of that junk, because when you have the positive case down, a lot of that stuff, it's just really easy to filter through the problems with some of the things that they're saying, or even if they don't know the answer, they have so much of the positive evidence under their belt first that it's not going to shake them nearly as much. So I don't know. I just thought that was one of the really cool things about it.
And that is true, that it's like Hidden in Plain View in the sense of being entirely positive, but it covers a wider, whereas T-Mom and The Eye of the Beholder are kind of dialoguing back and forth between positive and negative, but it covers a wider range of arguments than are found in Hidden in Plain View.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And I want to echo what you said, Eric. Like, I actually like work with the youth groups and the small groups in the school, like the teachings in the school of the church that I'm at. And so I'm actually planning on implementing this book and probably trying to convince my church to buy a few different copies of them for the small groups, because that's how much I love this book. And just kind of adding on to that, if you're familiar with T-Mom and all these other books that Dr. McGrew's written, there is extra stuff in there that she hasn't covered in it before. So if you're even familiar with her work, you still actually get something out of this, even if you're kind of as well read with Lydia McGrew's work as Eric and I are. So I just really like that as well.
Yeah, for sure. So Lydia, maybe you could tell us, if you don't mind, what are some of the challenges that you faced while working on this particular book?
Well, there were some practical challenges. So, as you can see, I tend to recline for a lot of my work now. So I was typing on a Bluetooth keyboard like this, and I was making so many more typos, because it's not the ideal posture, and so I just kept smacking my head and saying, oh man, I'm never going to catch, I got to have this, I'm going to have this proofread 5 times or something. I think in the end we did catch them all, but so there were just some technological things there. But I also thought that writing the questions was a bit of a challenge. I'd never done anything like that before. I was trying to hit it just right so that the questions didn't sound patronizing. I didn't want it to be like, what do you think we are, little kids,
Yeah.
But at the same time, I didn't want them to be so hard that people were put off by them. So I sent those questions to several different people. And I said, look, please read the content of the chapter. Please read the questions and the suggested answers and give me suggestions. And, they did. And they get thanks in my acknowledgments, for giving me suggestions. So I found that to be a challenge. I also thought it was a challenge to try to show that I have studied critical scholarship, negative scholarship, but without getting derailed into answering that in a lot of detail, because I paid my dues by doing, all the work that I did for T-Mom and Eye of the Beholder and these other things. I put a lot of time in, but I'm not here in this book to try to impress people by considering, all of these different objections that could be brought up. So it's a delicate balance where you want scholars to be willing to read the book. I actually think scholars can profit from the book,
Mhm.
but at the same time, you want to be pitching it to a lay audience so you keep that momentum going.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And so I know that is sometimes some of the pushback that you get is just like you kind of darned if you do and darned if you don't. I mean, you have obviously interacted with critical scholarship. It's not like you're not entrenched in these particular issues, obviously. But sometimes like people just kind of tend to breeze past that for some reason and just be like, well, now she's just a popularizer, and it's just like
Yeah.
you can't really win with some of these
Can't win.
people. But obviously, if people want to get into more depth, Team Mom, Eye of the Beholder, you definitely hit a lot on a lot of the things there, um, and so in the first couple of chapters, I thought maybe we could just kind of do a little kind of tour of the book, kind of give people an idea of what some of the contents are. And so the first couple of chapters, you talk about how the gospel authors have like a very thorough knowledge of geography, customs, culture, and they're not just getting like easy things right, like the name Herod or the city of Jerusalem or something goofy like that. They get hard things right. And so why is this casual mention of correct information especially valuable as evidence? And maybe you could kind of give us a couple of examples, like a little sampler of that, just to kind of give us an idea.
And there are just a lot, but that casualness, which is something I've been doing a little series on casualness on my YouTube channel recently. It really shows that the authors they're easy with this material because it's their life. They're embedded in the culture. So it's not labored at all. So an example here would be when John will say, they went down to Capernaum, and he's previously the person is in, let's say, Cana, in the hills. And so you actually do go down because it's downhill. Capernaum's actually lower than sea level. And if you're
Mhm.
walking it, you're going to feel that as you go down.
Hmm.
So it's very clear that this is a person who knows that area. And Cana was a really small village. It's very obscure. So to say they went down from Cana to Capernaum, that shows a person who he's just there. He just knows this stuff because he's been there, he's lived there. And you feel this a lot. So another example would be in Luke. It says that the Samaritans did not want to let Jesus stay in their village at the when he's going to Jerusalem, and it says because his face was set to go to Jerusalem. Now I've connected this with the Gospel of John, that it appears to be at the time of a festival. And what does his face being set to go to Jerusalem have to do with it? Now, Luke doesn't actually try to explain that at all. But when you go to Josephus, you find this tension between the Samaritans and the Jewish people, especially from Galilee, because the Jewish pilgrims would kind of go tromping through Samaria on their way to Jerusalem for their festivals. And it really annoyed them. They didn't say, "Oh, good, we're going to we're going to sell a lot of hotel rooms or something." No, it was just annoying to them. And so that's why it makes sense that because he was going to Jerusalem, because they regarded him as being part of this sort of wave of pilgrims coming through just at that time, that they would not want him to stay in their village. But again, it's just this very artless mention, and
Mhm.
that shows that connection with the culture, and that it was very complicated culture. It was not a simple culture. You had Samaritans and Jews and Romans and Greeks, and all of these people sort of living together in this very mixed cultural setting, very mixed political setting. And the Gospels are very sure-footed as they find their way through all of that, showing that close connection with a very narrow, very specific time and place.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I know one of the things that skeptics will often kind of throw out is just like it's this idea of like, well, why don't we have all these more external confirmations, of Jesus rising from the dead and all these different miracles and stuff like that? And it's kind of like, well, if we had that, those people writing that would probably have become Christians. Um, But it's interesting that what we do actually have shows like all of this intimate knowledge of the settings of the time, the customs, the places, and so yeah, to me, I think that this kind of evidence is actually like far more valuable, because if somebody just
Yeah.
converted and said, "Oh yeah, I believe it," they would just say, "Well, you're just biased because you're a Christian," and just discard it. So,
Yes,
um,
and actually we had, I believe he's passed away now, the historian, um, Meyer, who used to work here at, Paul Meyer,
Paul
who
Meyer,
used
yeah.
to, um yeah, who used to work here at, Western Michigan University. And some years ago, Tim was talking to him about that. You know, he was over here at the house and said it's these little incidental confirmations, right?
Mm.
And i- instead of, like you said, hey, today in other news in Galilee, Jesus fed the 5,000. You know, it's not like that. It's more subtle stuff. And Meyer said that's better. That's better, you know, and so
Yeah.
he saw that immediately. That's actually better confirmation.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to note too, in case anybody who's watching might be of a skeptical bent, one of the things that I constantly hear is like, well, you know, uh,
It's the Spider-Man fallacy.
Spider-Man, yeah, yeah, obviously, Stan Lee and all the comic book writers, they use, real stories set in New York City, and New York City's a real city. That doesn't mean that Spider-Man's real. The Green Goblin threw Gwen Stacy off the Brooklyn Bridge. Well, we know the Brooklyn Bridge existed. But I think what you're saying here is that any first of all, um, those people may have lived in New York City, or they could use Google or Wikipedia or an encyclopedia if it was 60s or 70s or whatever, and look these things up. They're pretty common knowledge, but these are things that are difficult, and you'd have to be like really close up to the times, really close up to the facts. And the more you are including these kind of facts, wouldn't it just give you kind of more opportunity to give yourself away?
Yes, yes, and, you know, there's so much wrong with the Spider-Man objection that I'm sure you've felt this, both of you. You almost find yourself stammering because you can think of so many things that are wrong with
Mhm.
it, and you're
Yeah.
like, "Oh, where do I start?"
Yeah.
Right? You know, where do I start? And one way sort of into that, to look at what's wrong with that objection, is to think about all the times that skeptics, and I'm sure many of the same skeptics who would bring up the Spider-Man objection, um, will try to say that the gospel writers get something wrong.
Hmm.
So, you know, I'm sure the very same person who would talk about the Spider-Man objection is going to say, Luke gets the census wrong, you know, and they're
Mhm.
gonna hammer on that. And Bart Ehrman, of course, does this too, you know, that they make mistakes or anything that can make the gospel authors supposedly look silly, even something ridiculous like Jesus riding two donkeys like a trick rider coming into Jerusalem or whatever.
Right.
So they obviously think that the negative side of that is highly relevant. If they think they can show that the authors didn't know the customs of the time, didn't know the geography, etc., they will for sure do it, and they will consider that relevant. But then when we're bringing in incident after incident and detail after detail that's showing that they actually knew the culture, the geography, and the customs and all this stuff intimately well, then they'll say, that doesn't necessarily mean anything at all, you know, and it's like suddenly, because it's not a proof, you know, like a deductive proof
Yeah.
of it, they will consider it irrelevant. In fact, Bart Ehrman is on record as saying that it's relevant if they make a mistake, but it's totally irrelevant if they get stuff right. I mean, that's
Mhm.
not even probabilistically possible. You know,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
actually probabilistically incoherent. Um, to say it's totally, it can't be totally irrelevant for them to get it right if it's relevant for them to get it wrong. So I think that when we point out that double standard, that helps us to point out that no, it's no small feat to show that these authors are deeply embedded in a pre-destruction of Jerusalem culture of Judea and Samaria and Galilee, and they know their way around that in such a way that they can just bring these things up in this extremely easy, casual manner that fits beautifully into their stories and into the time and place.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good. It's like if getting details wrong counts as evidence for it, then why wouldn't details of getting it right count
Yeah.
for it? So
Mhm.
it's kind of a heads I win, tails you lose kind of
Right,
thing.
it is. It
It's,
definitely is.
so
Yeah, that's really interesting how when you see those types of epistemic asymmetries when it comes to these types of things, where people want proof for that for the Christian thesis, but then just evidential chips in favor for the negation of it. We're all for that. So
Right. This is non-deductive inference,
hmm.
right? It's all non-deductive inference in any direction. We're not going to have a proof. Now there are evidential asymmetries, and I'll try not to get off onto a sideline here, but like arguments from silence.
Hmm.
My seeing a spider is much better evidence that there is a spider than my not seeing a spider is evidence that there is not a spider. So you get these asymmetries, but there's always going to be some force in in each direction. If anything, I would say that if there is an asymmetry, it goes the opposite direction. A small error can be made in good faith by somebody who really knows what he's talking about, but his going out and, in general knows what he's talking about, but he makes a slip. But to go out there and actually say something that's hard, that he could easily get wrong, and to find that he's getting it right is actually
mhm.
stronger evidence that he's well informed. So, if anything, any asymmetry should be regarded as going in the opposite direction, but neither of them is proof.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of even ties in. I could go way off into left field here, so I'll try not to. But even with the thing with the census of Quirinius, I think that you've told me about a possible hypothesis where Luke just makes like just a minor mistake,
Right.
mistaking Quirinius with somebody else similar or something like that.
With a name that sounds really similar. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's like should be considered as not a biggie. But when we say Luke gets all these things right in the Gospels, and then Colin Hemmer comes along and says, "Look at all these facts of the
Yes.
difficult details that he gets right in the
Mhm.
of the whole Asia Minor Greco Roman world and Asia Minor and all that stuff." It's just like, ah, it's just
Right.
kind
That doesn't necessarily mean anything. Right.
of
It's crazy. I know it's nuts. And you'll see this too, where Bart Ehrman will go to great lengths to argue that he was not a companion of Paul.
yeah,
Like he thinks it matters whether he was a companion of Paul or not. But
right,
then when we bring evidence that he was a companion of Paul, it's like, that's irrelevant. Well,
yeah.
Yeah.
he was treating it as relevant just 5 minutes ago. So yeah.
You did the book on undesigned coincidences, hidden in plain view. Um, but yet you still devoted a entire chapter on undesigned coincidences in this book. And so I thought that there was some really great new material in here, especially dealing with kind of the synoptic problem objection. But maybe we should back up for a second, maybe for those who just aren't familiar at all. Maybe tell us what an undesigned coincidence is, and maybe give an example, and then we could kind of get into some of the things that are new here with the
Right.
whole synoptic problem. So
Right. So, an undesigned coincidence, I like to call it an incidental interlocking that points to truth. And we'll often make the analogy to a jigsaw puzzle, where the pieces fit together. And when you force the pieces, they don't fit together and so forth. So, sometimes I'll just give like a contemporary sort of made up example because it's very, very quick. If you were interviewing witnesses to a robbery, and one witness said, the robber tripped as he was running away. He nearly
hmm,
fell and he recovered himself and he kept running. And then you interview a different person who claims to be a witness, and that person's describing his clothes and gets down to his shoes, describes the shoes, and then says, and I noticed that one of his shoes was untied.
hmm,
So that would be an undesigned coincidence. Neither one of them appears to be trying to connect it with the other person's testimony, but his having a shoe untied fits really well with his tripping. And so then this is evidence that they are, in fact, both genuine witnesses of what happened.
hmm,
So that's an example. So in the Gospels, what I'll do is I'll give an example that is in fact new in Testimonies, and wasn't hidden in plain view, but it's an example of an undesigned coincidence. So in the Synoptic Gospels, we have the healing of the blind man. He's named Bartimaeus in Mark, and then Matthew mentions two blind men in Jericho as Jesus is making his way for the last time to Jerusalem just before he dies. And it says that there's this big noise, and the blind men want to know, who is it? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. And they immediately start to cry out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on us, et cetera, and making a big clamor. And then they're brought to Jesus eventually, and he says, what do you want? And they say, we want to be healed. We want to receive our sight. So it could easily slip by our notice that in the synoptic gospels that tell this healing story, there has not been another healing recorded down that far in the land of Israel geographically prior to this incident. I mean, it's like crazy. You've had Jesus' whole ministry, and they haven't mentioned any miracle that has taken place heretofore in Jerusalem or in Jericho. The closest you get is on the border of Samaria and Galilee, but that's still not really nearby. Whereas Jericho and Jerusalem are closer. They're both in the south. So the question arises: why were these beggars so enthusiastic about Jesus and immediately thinking that maybe he could heal them the minute they hear his name? They immediately are like, wow, let's try to get his attention. Maybe he can give us our sight. Well, you go to John then, and you find that John, who records a lot more visits to the region of Jerusalem, he records two major miracles that would have happened not long before this. I would say in yeah, probably the 6 months previous to this, so not long before. In that area, one of them is the raising of Lazarus, which a lot of people, talked about. It was a big deal in Bethany, and then the other is the healing of the man born blind in Jerusalem. And so immediately, if they had heard of the healing of a man born blind, and we know that made a big splash because people were even mentioning it at the time of the raising of Lazarus, that they would have immediately thought, hey, he healed that guy who was born blind. Maybe he can heal us. So those fit together. The immediate recognition of Jesus as a healer, and specifically a healer of the blind in the synoptics, with the healing of the man born blind in John. But John doesn't mention the healing of the blind men in Jericho, and the synoptics don't mention the healing of the man born blind in Jerusalem. So it's kind of a cool fit. So that's an example of an undesigned coincidence, and also of something that is new in Testimonies.
One of the more helpful sections in the book, particularly with undesigned coincidences, was you talk about like independence and the synoptic problem. And so I know when I'm talking to skeptics or just people who aren't really a fan of undesigned coincidences, maybe they have a little bit of a background in gospel studies, there's just kind of like this dismissive attitude because, Erik, don't you know that there's this two source theory and Mark came first, and really anytime there's any sort of like changes in the gospel where Luke or Matthew stray from Mark, they're just doing this on purpose for some literary reason or something like that. And so there are no undesigned coincidences, which is obviously extremely naive to begin with. But do you mind just kind of breaking down why the synoptic problem isn't really a problem for undesigned coincidences?
Well, of course, one reason to begin with that you're hinting at there is that a lot of undesigned coincidences are between John and the synoptics anyway, so that doesn't even participate in the synoptic problem. But when we're talking about intra-synoptic coincidences, what I find a lot is that people are slipping between, hey, there are all these arguments that there's some literary dependence among the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, over to, hey, there's just overwhelming evidence that, as you said, anytime anything is new in particularly Matthew or Luke, it was just added without factual basis. Or like the term Markan priority or the two source hypothesis will be used ambiguously as between something very, very boring, very I'm going to say uncontroversial. I don't mean by that that there are no arguments on the other side, but not really anything all that big of a deal. Mark wrote first, and the others are somewhat dependent on him. And using Markan priority to mean, hey, Luke and Matthew, if they're telling the same story that's in Mark and there's extra stuff, they just made it up. Well, those
Mhm.
obviously mean very, very different things. Those aren't the same thing
Yeah.
at all. So I find that to some extent, this objection arises from a faulty idea that the only way that undesigned coincidences could possibly work or be relevant would be if the authors were witness separated, like they've been locked in separate rooms. They've never had any knowledge of anything that the other person wrote, so that if there's any information flow going there, then they can't possibly be adding any independent information. So to show that that's not true, we can go back to my sort of hypothetical modern example of the untied shoe and the tripping robber. It would be, of course, absolutely ideal if you had taken these two putative witnesses and had locked them in separate police cars and taken their statements. But let's suppose you didn't. Okay? We still need to recognize that they don't look like they're trying to refer to one another. So consider the difference between the person saying, here was the clothing that the robber was wearing, and he gets to the shoes and he says, and one of his shoes was untied, and his jumping forward when you're interviewing the first guy and going, oh, that must be um that must have happened because his shoe was untied. Here's the first guy mention that he tripped and fell. All right. Now that's a sign that he's not making it up necessarily, but he is trying to connect it. It's not casual. He's definitely trying to connect it.
Mhm.
But the apparent casualness shows that, even if they haven't been locked in separate police cars, they appear to be telling these things just
Right.
because that's what they remembered, and not because they're trying to super subtly allude to each other. Um, so the guy tells about the tripping, but he doesn't mention the untied shoe. That's casualness. That's evidence that he's not trying to connect them. So when we find this in the synoptics, where there's no appearance of attempting to connect the things in an intra synoptic coincidence, then that's evidence that, in fact, they're not trying to connect the
Mhm.
things. And so we need to be open to that possibility that you could have some literary dependence, but still have partial factual dependence. Things that, for example, I often say this about Matthew, especially, that Matthew knows that he didn't just get from Mark.
Yeah.
So literary dependence doesn't automatically show complete factual dependence. And literary independence, interestingly, doesn't always show complete factual independence either.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
another interesting story. People will find this interesting if they watch my YouTube videos on uh, what I think about the synaptic problem, and also some recent video I did on different kinds of dependence and independence and the virtue of casualness. So that's the answer from a general sort of a
Yeah.
point of view.
Yeah. You have
Yeah.
a really good video on your YouTube channel covering this topic in particular too. So if
Mhm.
people want more information on that, I think Eric and I can both echo
Yeah.
this when we say go watch that.
I was literally going to jump in and say you've done like a 3-part series recently on it on your channel. It's just been really, really good, and so definitely I would recommend that, because it just people just tend to look at this in an extremely black and white way. And I think one of the things that you mentioned in the book too is just like if they're just like so working from one another so closely, what's the deal with all the contradictions?
Yes,
Yeah.
and that is such an important point, that contradictions, if you're sitting and you're poring over it, it's amazing. You'll literally find scholars who will imply that these are open and they're going back and forth, and even the most trivial verbal differences are
Mm.
heavy. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
oh man, why did he use that synonym instead of this other thing? And it's like, well, my goodness, if they're being that careful, then why are there any apparent contradictions at all?
Right.
Yeah.
So it's evidence that they actually have somewhat of their own information, even to the point of sometimes appearing to contradict.
Mhm.
Yeah. That kind of leads into the next question, right? Which is a lot of skeptics will like to point to contradictions within the Gospels, Bart Ehrman specifically, and you kind of flip this on its head in your book, and you coined a chapter called "Reconcilable Variations." Can you explain what those are and kind of your goal with that chapter?
I got the phrase from a 19th century author, and I think it's a great phrase. So the way I use it here is a little more restrictive than the way he used it. Um, I'm especially using it to refer to things that might, at least at first blush, appear to be discrepancies, but that even some degree of imagination and thought show that they actually needn't be. And so it's sort of like the documents are surviving a test. So the apparent discrepancy is it's kind of a test. It's pushing on them. Like you would in engineering, you might subject something to heat or something to see if it's going to explode or whatever. And then when you find that they actually can, without like some big strained thing, they can be made reasonably to fit together, then they're passing that test. And they're passing that test over and over again. Now, the way I sometimes put it is that um, scholars of the Gospels, they're like the princess and the pea, you know? And reconciliations of discrepancies are like the pea, and it's down under five mattresses, and the princess is still going, oh, it's this huge problem, I can't sleep at night, kind of thing. And that the New Testament scholar just is almost allergic to any kind of harmonization, but actually we find that a lot of times that makes sense. And
Mhm.
so that's what a reconcilable variation is, and it's especially noticeable in a place where it would be so easy um, to just be completely irreconcilable, and yet we find them to be reconcilable. So that's its own kind of confirmation.
Yeah. And it kind of again goes back to some double standards that people can tend to have. It's just like historians reconcile
Yes.
events, detectives reconcile testimony and events and different things like that. Lawyers do. But you all of a sudden, something is reported in the Bible and there's a variation or an apparent discrepancy, and you reconcile it in a way that's reasonable, that uses just, real world imagination, as you refer to often in the book, that's not strained, it's not forced. So all of a sudden it's like, whoa, 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 you can't do that. It's just like there's this assumption that you're just smuggling in some sort of religious ideology and you're just so
Hmm.
wedded to inerrancy, which you're not an inerrantist, but um and so that doesn't
Even
work on you.
specific views of inspiration are typically smuggled in
Yeah.
with these types of things.
Yeah.
Which is not the case, and it's unfortunate that I think a lot of Christians have internalized that as well. Um, and they're constantly, I think people constantly questioning themselves, especially in the world of scholarship. Like, did I just do that because I have to sign an inerrancy statement? Why did I do that? Am I just trying to hang on to my inerrancy card or whatever? Um, and it's just assumed over and over and over again that it's a religious activity. But as you're pointing out, Eric, it's not a religious activity. And so I think we really need to push back on that and say, yeah, I'm not doing this for a religious reason. I've had people where I will be exchanging email and the person will say, and like even a Christian, the person will say, now, we need to realize as Christians that just because we believe the Bible is God's word, other people don't share that assumption and um, of inerrancy or whatever. And I'll go, I'm not an inerrantist. And then they'll just like go on talking. So to three more emails. Excuse me, I'm not actually an inerrantist, and it's like you have to hit them over the head with it because it's almost impossible for them to imagine that you would be harmonizing so much unless it was for a religious reason. That's just um, a very bad assumption, and it's something that I want to say to anybody who's going to seminary right now, any Christian, even if you are an inerrantist, get that separated from from harmonization. Think about harmonization in a way that is historical, and just get rid of that false conscience and that feeling like, oh man, I'm not being an honest scholar.
Mhm.
And you need to shake off that kind of fear, because harmonization does not mean that you're not being an honest scholar per
Yep.
se.
Right. Right.
I love that because I am an inerrantist, and I always tell people like, look, the exact same thing that you just said. Whether you're an inerrantist or not, you can separate that ideology or that belief that you have and do the work and still come to the right conclusion. So I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, and for anybody who's curious, I would say, Lydia, you obviously have an extremely high view of the reliability of the
Right.
Gospels. And so there's evangelical scholars, which you've talked about in your other books, but I would definitely recommend, if you like this book, go back and get these things, because there are evangelical scholars who basically almost have to like bend over backwards. We're talking about like strained harmonization. It's like
Hmm.
there's some sort of strained thinking going,
Disharmonization.
disharmonization, and then
Right.
it's just like, but I'm still holding on to an inerrancy somehow. I'm just completely redefining it to where like
Right.
the gospel writers are changing all kinds of facts that
Yeah.
doesn't make sense. And
Right.
so
Right. Right.
that's just a much
Yeah.
higher
So
view, in my opinion.
I stuck to the same definition of inerrancy that most people think of when they think of that. And then
Mm,
that's why I said I wasn't one,
Yeah.
instead of, redefining it. So that's a whole interesting thing in itself. But I think it's so important that people not quietly develop a sense of guilt,
mhm,
Hmm.
as scholars, because then that they're kind of tamping that down, they're kind of keeping it inside, and then boom, maybe they completely deconvert, or maybe they adopt views that the gospel authors made up things, because it just feels like this deliverance. Instead, just be willing to kind of say, you know what, you guys have way too much of an allergy to harmonization, and it's actually not a bad thing. I had an interview yesterday with Shane Rosenthal. He used to do the White Horse Inn,
mhm.
and now he has a new podcast. So I'll just put a plug out here for it, called The Humble Skeptic. Skeptic there, he's a Christian, doesn't mean non-Christian skeptic. His pilot episode of that had a great discussion of his father, who claimed to have actually seen Billy Joel play at a piano bar, very much like, in Piano Man, the song Piano Man, um, in a certain year. And Shane tells this whole story about how, when he looked stuff up on Wikipedia, it appeared that his father could not have seen Billy Joel at a piano bar, because, Billy Joel was in California and his father had already moved somewhere else and so forth. And so Shane interviewed him. He interviewed his mother. And I mean, he's got like clips of these interviews in the pilot episode. Um, and he went and kept, Googling and looking around. And it eventually turned out that his father actually was right, and his father had taken a visit to California during that time, and the corner that his father remembered that the piano bar was on, that actually made sense too, and that it was all reconcilable. But it took some delving in, and this was just this very ordinary real life kind of thing. Um, Obviously, Shane wasn't just doing it because, he loves his dad and he's got this kind of piety toward his dad, but because he was curious about whether it had really happened, or what kind of a mistake his dad had made or hadn't made. So it just makes a fascinating exercise in real world harmonization in an area where there's nothing religious at stake. And I think
Mhm.
it shows the reasonable nature of doing that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Something that kind of ties in, speaking of which, you introduce a chapter on unexplained illusions. And so I think you tell a story about uh, a lady visiting like a teachers meeting or something like that, and she just uses some kind of jargon that basically nobody would understand unless they had a kid enrolled in that district or something like that. And you use it as a kind of a real life example of an unexplained illusion. Then you talk about how the gospels are constantly, we see unexplained illusions. And so do you want to could you elaborate a little bit, because I'm probably butchering it a little bit. So what is an unexplained illusion, and kind of what are their significance, and maybe you could give us like a small sampler of that.
Yeah. So, and that's one thing that's unique, I think, about my book. I think it may be the only book out there on gospel reliability that discusses unexplained allusions. And that phrase is my phrase. I got several examples from the late Johannine scholar Leon Morris, but he doesn't use that phrase. So we often find that when people are talking, they throw things in and maybe they forget that the person who's hearing them isn't going to know what they're talking about. So, the example I gave there was for a woman to say, I had to go to my child's IEP meeting. And so, like, if you've got a kid in the public school, you know what an IEP meeting is, and it has to do with, like a plan for a student with special needs and so forth. But let's say that her audience are all, empty nesters or homeschoolers or something, and they don't know what an IEP meeting is. And she doesn't realize that, or she doesn't have to worry about that. She's just like telling that she got into a car accident while she was on her way to the meeting. That she wants to get on with her story. And we do that sometimes. You might say, that was the day I had to take Jenny to the doctor. And then you forget that this person doesn't know that Jenny is the name of your niece, right? But you just want to get on and tell whatever you're going to tell. So that's a sign of truthfulness because the person doesn't have one eye on the audience all the time. Now, it's not necessarily bad to have an eye on your audience, but the older authors would sometimes use the word artlessness. We might call it unself-conscious truthfulness. So when you're not self-conscious, you're focused on your story, right, rather than on your audience. Then this might happen, that you mention something that your audience doesn't understand, and you don't pause to think about the fact that your audience doesn't understand. This view of the authors is completely at variance with the critical scholarly view. You should just open a lot of commentaries, right? Even commentaries by authors who maybe think that the gospel authors aren't making things up, but all the more so if they think they are. And they'll be like, John knew that his audience would recognize this hyper, diaper, super subtle reference to a religious practice, and they're constantly attributing to the author a view of his own audience and to the audience this kind of extreme learnedness and knowledge and ability to pick up on everything, even if it's in there kind of subtly like a code or whatever. And it's very unrealistic. And when I characterize the Gospels as memoir or reportage, I think we should be thinking more about something like you're sitting down with your uncle and you're saying, Uncle so and so, what was it like in the Iraq War? And he's just going to start telling you, right, about things that happened, and that does happen. So an example of an unexplained allusion in the Gospels would be in John 3, where there are these disciples of John the Baptist, and they come to John the Baptist, and it says that before they come to him, they have been having a dispute with a Jew about purification. Okay, it's an important topic to a Jew. They come to John the Baptist and they say, that one whom you testified to when you were baptizing, all men are coming to him now. And so in other words, they're complaining about Jesus' popularity. He's baptizing and all men are coming to him. Actually, John explains later, Jesus didn't personally baptize anyone, but his disciples did. Okay, so it's clear that the disciples of John the Baptist are jealous of the popularity of Jesus' ministry. But it doesn't tie it in clearly with that dispute about purification. Were they arguing with a disciple of Jesus? That's a reasonable conjecture, but it doesn't say that. Did Jesus' disciples baptize, I don't know, did they sprinkle and John the Baptist, immersed? Did they, use a different formula of words or what? And John the Baptist himself, when it reports how he answers them, he doesn't tie it in. He doesn't say, so therefore, you were wrong and the guy you were arguing with was right. It never gets back to that again. John the Baptist just talks about Jesus and how he must increase and I must decrease. And, he's very humble about Jesus. that's an example of unexplained allusion. That I think the evangelist John, he knew what the dispute was about. He may even have at one time been a disciple of John the Baptist. That's a conjecture that some make.
Mhm.
It's not implausible. And now by this time, he's a disciple of Jesus, right?
Mhm.
But so he's got, maybe friends on both sides of the argument or whatever. So he knew that that argument was what led them to go and make this complaint to John the Baptist. But he just wants to get on to tell you what John the Baptist said about it. And that wonderful thing that John the Baptist said, he must increase and I must decrease. And he doesn't bother to gratify the curiosity of his audience about what the dispute was about or how it ties in. So that's one example. And there are a number of others.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely has more of the texture of testimony. It's like you said, it's like the constant thing that we're hearing is like, oh, these are highly literary and very theological treatises and all these other things mixed in with this, storytelling and fictionalization, as well as maybe some real facts and stuff like that. And I think this is what you bring as somebody who specializes in like epistemology and evaluating testimony and different things like that. That is unique because it just completely, like you said, just cuts against all of that kind of stuff.
Right.
And
It's a
so,
very different view of the
yeah,
Gospels from what
Yeah.
you'll find in the discipline, and I'm unapologetic about that, but I want to make an argument that is cogent as well. So
right.
I'm asking them to accept something that's maybe surprising, and I'm also trying then on the other hand to hearten the layman
Mhm.
who might instinctively think of it this way,
Yeah.
um, but might not know whether there's any really good way to defend that, to show him how he can make that explicit and defend that.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I know you've talked before about kind of a people when they read the Gospels. I know, at least in my conversion, particularly, um, my grandma gave me a Bible. It ended up in the basement collecting dust for years. And then as soon as I became interested in is Christianity true or not, I started to read it, and it definitely had that ring of testimony. I like what you said there, because I didn't know how to necessarily articulate all of the things that I was noticing. But it sure seemed like it had, like I said, they're really trying to tell things as they're happening. And it was hard to explain away all this other stuff. And yeah, it just puts it in a way more articulate way that just the average person on the street can get. And so,
Yeah.
um, something kind of related to that, there's unnecessary details, and how that relates to reliability. And so I thought that chapter was really interesting. You talk about like there's kind of like a Goldilocks zone. And so maybe explain that real quick, of what unnecessary details are and how they're indicators of truthful testimony.
Right. So unexplained allusions tend to be kind of like a subcategory of unnecessary details. Um, but unnecessary details more broadly would be like if somebody, you just throw something in there. And it's amazing when you listen to people, they do. They'll be like, and that was in May that happened. They keep going and it's like doesn't matter that it was in May. It doesn't add anything to the story. They just thought of the fact that it was in May, and people have irrelevant minds sometimes, and that's how they talk. Um, so that's again part of that texture of testimony, and the Gospels do that. Um, they they've got these things. Sometimes they're very vivid, like that they sat down on the green grass um, at the time of the feeding of the 5,000. But sometimes they're not even especially vivid. They might just be something that gets put in there unnecessarily. Like he'd been sick for 38 years. Like who cares? There's nothing about 38 years that's any more exciting than 40 years,
Hmm.
particularly, right?
Mm.
But just put in this thing it's not even a round number. Um, and this this fits into the Goldilocks zone. So here's what I mean by that.
Mm.
Goldilocks, the little girl, and she tries uh, porridge that's too hot and the porridge that's too cold, and then Baby Bear's porridge is just right, right? So
Hmm.
that's the zone where it's just right. Um, Sometimes skeptics will try to say, oh, that's just what fiction is like, right? Well, to begin with, they don't know much about ancient fiction. So, go read Caliroe, because that'll be brought up every time I mention this, and I'll say they didn't have hyper realistic ancient fiction. They'll say, yes, they did, and they'll name like one novel, and I'll be like, yeah, I said hyper realistic. Go read it. It's a fun romance, but it's definitely not hyper realistic. So ancient fiction and ancient rhetoric tend to be super over the top. Like all the gold and the purple cloth and the many mourners and on and on and on, right? Or Quintilian was a rhetorical writer, and he is advising lawyers on how to, make the jury cry, basically, show them, the screams of the victim, this kind of thing. It's very, very over the top. And the Gospels aren't like that. They're very restrained with comparison to that. But they're also not like modern fiction. So it's not even like they, just some genius, invented modern fiction before modern fiction. If you pick up a work of modern fiction and you start reading, the fiction author will pick a level of detail that he wants to narrate within a given scene, and he'll tend to stick with that level of detail in that scene. So if he's going to tell you that the speaker is playing with his pipe, right? Then he'll tell you that he lights his pipe, and then a little bit later he'll tell you that he set the pipe down. It went out, so he relighted it. He'll keep going with the business with the pipe, right?
Yeah.
Through that scene. Now, a different portion of the novel, he might be going over a lot of stuff quickly, and he's not going to go into a lot of detail, but there's a consistency to that. The Gospels are not like that. What you have instead are these flashes of detail that will flash out, and suddenly, John will be mentioning Jesus being moved in spirit at the grave of Lazarus, and he uses a word that means snorted. And we don't even know why. Was he angry at Satan? Was he angry at death? Was he angry at people's unbelief, or what? But it's just this vivid detail, or at the washing of the feet, he'll say, he set aside his garment and he girded himself with a cloth and he washed their feet, right? And then we move to dialogue with Jesus and Peter, but it'll get real vivid for a little while, and then it'll back off again suddenly. Or you'll have one detail. Mark will mention Jesus sleeping on the pillow, in the boat, but he doesn't say, and Jesus got up and he wrung all the water out of the pillow because it got really wet because of the storm, right? He doesn't keep it going. So they fit into this Goldilocks zone that's neither ancient nor modern, but that will remind you of memoir. It will remind you of the way that people tell things, where they'll suddenly say, and I remember that it was pouring cats and dogs, and my feet got completely wet. And then they'll go on and just tell the story. That's what they're like.
Yeah, I once did a video on this particular kind of evidence, and I had a skeptic, and there's a lot of this in John's gospel. Like at the wedding of Cana, like he talks about, like there was 6 water pots, and I think they held 20 to 30 gallons or something like that. Just this is kind of random detail. And so he's like, oh, well, yeah, sure. Well, other apocryphal writings do that too, like the Acts of Thomas. And then he read to the scene from the Acts of Thomas where it's talking about like Thomas attending a wedding feast of King Gundasaurus. I might be mispronouncing that. And like, there's like Thomas won't eat or drink, and there's this flute girl that's dancing in front of him, and it's super detailed and way sappy. And then like he's considered to be rude, and he's hit over the head by the royal cupbearer. And then Thomas just gets up and sings this praise and all this weird stuff. And then the flute girl just breaks her flute, and it describes that in all this detail. And she repents and becomes Thomas's first disciple. And I'm like, do you know how to read? Like, what? Like, why are you making? Don't, like, you're proving my point, dude. So I just think that's I thought that was really interesting, that whole Goldilocks. So because
people can't hear it,
and
that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to train people's ears, and it may be that skeptic you were talking to, he's not gonna get it. He's not gonna see it. But I'm hoping that there are people out here who are going to read this book, and their ears are going to be trained so that
Mhm.
when they encounter that, if they encounter that skeptic on an airplane,
Mhm.
they're going to go, no, actually, that passage in Thomas is not anything like the Gospels, and
Yeah.
here's why. And they're going to
Mhm.
know how to say that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so you're on your last two chapters, you talk about unified personalities. So what do you mean by that? And why is this like an important topic that you wanted to hit on in your book?
So I'm talking about people in the Gospels who appear in more than one scene, and they're the same person in these scenes, but in different ways. The two that are most striking there are Jesus and Peter, and that's because there are so many stories about Jesus and Peter. And I wanted to emphasize how hard that is. That is really hard to get it right. And I find again that sometimes skeptics have an infinite amount of imagination for the amount of pains that people are willing to put in to make things seem subtly alike. But that's actually not something that hoaxers tend to do. That's not something that we find in ancient fiction or the Gnostic Gospels or anything like that. Um, so so for example, you just brought Thomas singing a song of praise. Can you imagine Thomas in the Gospels? I mean, I bet he didn't even sing. You know, he's this kind of grumpy guy, you know, in
Yeah.
the Gospels, right? Um, but that it's hard to do, we can see even from modern television shows where they've got all the resources. They could play all the earlier shows, you know, for themselves to try to make it consistent. And they don't always make it consistent. I was just thinking, I was on a walk today. So I watched, I think, every episode of Foyle's War during this past year. And you know how in all the earlier seasons, Foyle can't drive, right? And so that's why he has a driver. Sam Stewart is his driver, which takes, you know, an entire extra person during the war um, to drive for him. You're clearly supposed to think that Foyle cannot drive, but you get toward the end, and I think it may have been the finale before they took a break. And there's a woman going into labor, and there's nobody else around to drive. And so ta-da! Turns out Foyle actually can drive and jumps in a car and takes her to the hospital. And then
Mhm.
they're like, "Wait, I thought you couldn't drive." And he says, "Well, I never said I couldn't drive. I just didn't want to drive." Now that's absurd. It's completely inconsistent, but you can tell that that's just something that the scriptwriters wanted to do so that if they continued the series, he didn't always have to have a driver,
Mhm.
right? Um, so they couldn't even bother to be consistent with the question, you know, can Foyle drive? So we find, in contrast, in the Gospels, that Jesus is this incredibly vivid person, and Peter is this very vivid person who shows up in scene after scene after scene, and he's always the same person, but in different ways. And it's subtle, but it's believable and it's realistic. And I think you can only get that from life. I really do.
Yeah, definitely. So, and it's interesting too because it's like you said, it's like these critics have this idea that they're just like super duper 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 careful and trying really hard, and yet they're like, "Ha! Look at this goofy mistake," or
Right.
"Look at this alleged contradiction," and it's just like, pick a plot line here. Like, are they goofballs who can't get things right, or are they, really really crafty? And so, um, and yeah, I do notice that with other shows. While you were saying that story, I thought of like I used to watch. It's a silly show. It's Parks and Recreation, and like the main character, Rachel Nope. I think is it Leslie Nope, not Rachel Nope.
Leslie Nope.
Yeah, like she's like becomes this very competent person, but the first season she's basically like the female version of Michael Scott, from The Office, and how much like she changes the character that's played by Chris Pratt is constantly changing throughout. It's like not consistent at all. And I know it's just a comedy, but it's kind of a
And
similar
they
thing.
could have.
Right.
They could have made it more consistent, but they didn't, you know, they didn't bother.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And I think it's really good that you keep emphasizing that, Eric, about picking a plot line. That is a point that I have found Christian scholars, some of them even don't appreciate, and certainly skeptics don't appreciate it. That you cannot make your imagined character of the author infinitely malleable, where
Mhm.
you can make him a blunderer one moment and super crafty the next moment. Um, what are you really picturing this person who wrote
Yeah.
this book as being like? You need to stop and think about that, and I'm constantly doing that when I'm advocating the reportage model of the Gospels, is a certain view of the authors and trying to get people to think about that. What were they really like?
Mhm.
Yeah. So that kind of ties in with our last question here that I wanted to ask you. Personally, for me, I this was one of my favorite chapters, um, and it was your unmistakable Jesus chapter. So for me, I personally just loved it because, um, especially for people like me and probably like you, Eric, sometimes we might over intellectualize our faith, and maybe when we're praying to God, or we're just kind of like trying to think of a picture of somebody that might have been Jesus sometimes, or trying to fit a personality or something, right? And at least for me, I really enjoyed this because it just kind of gave me a new aspect to my faith and my prayer life, even, um, that I think a lot of people can get out of. But also just from a historical Jesus study kind of perspective, it's really cool too. Why don't you just talk about that chapter? What your goal was?
I'm trying in the whole book, but I really felt it strongly in that chapter to kind of bring together, connect the prose and the passion, as the saying goes. I'm trying to connect the intellectual side of it with the practical side of our Christian life,
Hmm.
and to just reach out to people and say this is why this all really matters. It really matters. We want to know Jesus. We want to know who he is. We want to follow him if we're Christians, and we want to introduce other people to him who are not Christians. So who is Jesus really? And so I'm showing it evidentially, like we were just talking about, that it's the same Jesus. It's his same, the way his mind works, the way his personality works, maybe some unexpected aspects, like he's sarcastic, he's got an edge to him at times, and so forth. But at the same time, he's someone to whom we can come with our problems and who will understand us. And so I'm trying to sort of apply that passage in Hebrews, that he can be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. He was tested like we are, but without sin. And what might that look like? So I try not to dive too deep into the theology, but I got a little bit on a limb that when he was on the cross, I think he may have felt separated from the Father, even though he wasn't
Hmm.
metaphysically really separated from the Father. Or I think when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, I think he was really afraid of the cross. I think, as C.S. Lewis said, doubtless he had seen men crucified.
Hmm.
That it just came to him. He's horrified. He's afraid. And so that's okay. It's okay to be afraid.
Yeah.
It's okay to be hurting. It's okay to be to feel alone. Your feelings are not per se in and of themselves a sin or whatever, and it's what we do with them. So I'm trying to do something that has sort of an application
Mhm.
aspect to it there, but also an evidential apologetic aspect, and to bring that together in a way that's seamless and enjoyable, and that just has both of those impacts both at the same time. So
Yeah.
it seems like for you, then, that was a success in that
Yeah,
regard.
I loved it. I'm kind of a teddy bear when it comes to my faith and my family, and that's about it. So that I teared up a little bit, like, just reading that chapter just because it kind of reinvigorated my faith, and I really appreciated that. So you hit the
That's right.
teddy bear spot for me with that
All
chapter.
right, all right.
If
That's
you really
good.
want to hit the teddy bear part, I know you talk about it in the book, the I Told You So. You have a video though,
Yes.
like that one was so good. Like I'm normally like, okay, it's Sunday, Lydia's got a new video, and I'm gonna nerd out here. And then you did the I Told You So, and I'm just like, oh, I'm in a glass case of emotion. No, I'm just kidding. But no, that was really good. Like it
Put
was
put a link to
really
it,
touching.
down in the
Yeah.
I will.
description with this, so people will go to it. And I'm actually a complementarian, so I don't like to say I'm preaching, but if you're a pastor out there and you want to use this stuff to preach it, go for it.
Yeah.
Preach it. Maybe give me a verbal sight, verbal hat tip. But I'm hoping that this is going to be useful to pastors and laymen and scholars and all those different kind of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely will be.
Yeah. That one was a good one. And then also, as just a dad, I was like, okay, well, if Jesus can use puns, then I just, I'm going to be an imitator of Christ and you can do lame puns. I'm always making, the kids
Right.
and the eyes roll their eyes. So, but,
Well, and
but
that,
yeah.
that thing about Jesus making plays on words, that's one that just every time I think about it, it strikes me that it's the same guy. It's
Hmm.
the
Yeah.
same mind. It's not something you're going to make up. That isn't just one, so the three, I'm just going to put this out there as a teaser, the three stories involved, and then go get the book and you can read it in there, but are Jesus healing the woman who has been bent over for 18 years, um, Jesus healing the man who's crippled at the pool of Bethesda, and then some comments he makes about that later. And then Jesus woes to the Pharisees in Matthew 23. What's the connection between all of these? Well, it's a certain way that Jesus' mind works, but that's unexpected that those three would all be connected. And if some skeptic's going to come along and say, oh, yeah, um, Luke and John and Matthew, they just all put that in there, these three completely different stories to try to make it look like it was the same person. If you'll believe that, you'll believe anything because it's really the kind of thing you only get from a real person, but his mind works in a certain way. So read the book to find out more about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
And so that kind of leads to this. Where can people buy the book?
Go to Amazon first. If they're saying we're, temporarily out of stock, the dreaded temporarily out of stock sign on Amazon, go to Barnes and Noble because Amazon sometimes doesn't get as many into its warehouse as it needs to. And then if you do it in a different way that gives them more money, they will get more in. So it's kind of a monopolistic practice. So if it says it's temporarily out of stock, go over to Barnes and Noble or just order it, and it only that always resolves within just a few days. So that's the best way to do that. If you want to get like a bulk discount, like especially if you wanted 50 or more, contact the publisher, DeWard Publishing, and that's where you would actually get a discount. Or if you just want a box of them of a lesser amount, you don't necessarily want a discount, pay media mail rate without overloading Amazon. You can also go to DeWard and get in touch with them and say, hey, I'd like to buy, like a whole box of Lydia's books. But for individual purchases, I know even of some people who are going to teach it in a class, they are just telling their students, go get it on Amazon. And if you've got Amazon Prime, you'll even get, free shipping and so forth. So I'm hoping that we can keep Amazon informed of the fact that this is moving so that they will keep their stock up.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool,
So
cool.
it's
And all
definitely my
those links
new.
will all
Oh,
those
go
links
ahead.
will be in the description of the video for everybody. So
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I was just going to say it's definitely my new go-to as far as recommendations. If somebody's going to come to me and say, "Hey, Eric, how can I learn more about the reliability of the Gospels?"
yep.
Um,
It's on
I
my it's gonna be on my website because it's officially out now, right?
Yes, it
Right, Lydia?
is.
Okay. Yeah,
yep,
so I'll be updating my website and on my recommended books section of my website. Your book is gonna be there.
So your one-stop shop, right? For all these arguments for the reliability of the Gospels. So
Yep.
there we go.
thank you guys. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, this is awesome. Eric, anything you wanna add in before we close this out?
No, just again, thanks for doing the interview and for writing the book. And yeah, I just can't recommend it enough.
Yeah. Thanks again,
Thank you
Dr. McGrew.
guys.
Thank you everybody for listening. Go buy the book. Again, the links are in the description.